I counted. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. That's how long I'd been at Cowrie Financial Partners, not because I'd been keeping a calendar on the wall, but because I remembered the exact date I walked in for my first day. A Tuesday in February, raining, which honestly should have told me something about how things would eventually go. I was 26, fresh out of my postgrad, and I thought I'd landed somewhere real, somewhere I could actually build something. My name is Isla McIntosh, and for 3 years, I was the quiet one in the corner who remembered everything. Cowrie Financial Partners is a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Wellington. Not the flashiest outfit in the city, but solid, reputable. The kind of place that got referrals from law firms and family trusts and old money that had been sitting quietly in the same portfolios for decades. I joined as a junior compliance analyst, which means I spent a lot of time reading documents that other people signed and trusted me to check. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted to senior compliance analyst. By year 2, I was leading a small team of 4. By year 3, I was managing the firm's internal audit trail. Every transaction, every client account movement, every advisory fee that went in or out. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was good at it. My manager at the time, a fair woman named Carolyn, who left to have her second baby and never came back full-time, that used to say, I had the kind of brain that notices when one number is off by 2 cents in a $20 million ledger. She meant it as a compliment. I think about that a lot now. I should explain the structure of the firm, because it matters later. At the top was our managing director, a man I'll call my MD tall, silver-haired, the kind of person who wore French cuffs on a Tuesday and made it look effortless. He'd built the firm from almost nothing 20 years earlier, and he ran it with the absolute conviction that the people around him were an extension of his own judgment. He didn't micromanage, he trusted, which is admirable in a lot of ways. And in one very specific way, it nearly destroyed everything. Below him was the head of client advisory, who I'll call my head of advisory. He'd been with the firm for 11 years. He was charming the way that some people are charming smoothly, consistently, in a way that never quite felt personal. He had a habit of stopping by your desk and asking about your weekend right before he needed something from you. I noticed that pattern early on. I filed it away. And then there was me and my team. 4 analysts. A guy named Theo who just turned 24 and was frighteningly good with spreadsheets. A woman named Vashti who'd come from a banking background and had a quiet authority that made clients instantly trust her. Rupert, who was methodical to the point of being slow, but never, ever made errors. And a newer addition, a young woman named Saren, who was 6 months in and still finding her feet, but already showing a sharpness that reminded me a little of myself. We handled compliance. We were the paper trail. We were the ones who noticed things. And that, it turned out, made us a very convenient target. It started with a meeting I wasn't supposed to know about. I only found out because Theo had gone to print something off the shared printer near the boardroom and overheard voices. He came back to his desk and said, quietly, I think something's going on. My head of advisory was in there, with the external auditors, and he closed the door really fast when he saw me. I didn't think much of it at the time. External auditors come through twice a year. Closed doors happen. I went back to the client reconciliation I was working on. 2 days later, my MD called me into his office. I want to describe that room, because the feeling of it stayed with me for a long time afterward. It had a wide window, looking out over the harbor, and on a clear day, you could see the Kapiti coast. That morning, the cloud was low, and the water was gray and flat. He was standing when I came in, not sitting. His chair was pushed back from his desk like he'd stood up in a hurry and hadn't moved it back. He didn't offer me a seat. Isla, he said, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me. I said, of course. There are irregularities in the client advisory fee ledger, he said, going back roughly 14 months. The external audit flagged 3 accounts where fees appear to have been misapplied, redirected, in fact, into a holding account we can't immediately identify. The total discrepancy is just over $1.4 million. I felt the room tilt slightly, not because I was surprised a discrepancy existed. I'd actually been tracking a small anomaly in one of those accounts for the last 6 weeks, waiting until I had enough data to bring it forward formally. But because of what he said next, the trail leads back to compliance, to your team's authorization codes. The silence after that was very long. The harbor outside was completely still. My team didn't authorize those movements, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. The authorization codes say otherwise. Then the codes were used without our knowledge. Or they were copied. Or someone had access they shouldn't have had. He looked at me for a long moment. He wasn't unkind. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't sneering or triumphant. He looked genuinely, deeply uncomfortable. But he also looked like a man who had already started constructing an explanation for what had gone wrong, and my team fit neatly into the space he'd built for it. I have to take this seriously, he said. I'd expect nothing less, I said. And I'd ask you to take equally seriously the possibility that my team has been set up. He said he'd be in touch. He asked me not to discuss it with my team yet. I agreed, walked back to my desk, sat down, and quietly opened the folder I'd been building for the last 6 weeks. Here's the thing about working in compliance. You develop a habit of documentation that goes beyond what's required. It's not paranoia, exactly. It's more like you understand, at a cellular level, that things can go wrong, and that when they do, the difference between clarity and chaos is the paper trail. So for my very first week at the firm, I'd kept records. Not just the official logs, personal notes, timestamped screenshots. A running document I updated at the end of each week, noting anything that felt slightly off an unusual access request, a transaction that came through outside normal hours, a verbal instruction I received that didn't match what appeared in the system later. I'd started the folder on those specific client accounts in September. It was now late November. What I had was this: 6 weeks of evidence showing that the authorization codes belonging to my team had been used outside of business hours twice on a Saturday, once at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, on dates when I could prove, with swipe card records and email timestamps, that none of us had been in the building or logged into our work systems. The codes had been used from a different IP address than our usual workstations, and the transactions themselves, the ones rerouting the advisory fees, had a specific pattern in the account reference fields that didn't match any notation system my team had ever used, but did match a shorthand I had seen exactly once before, in a draft document that had sat on the head of advisory's shared drive for about 3 days before being deleted. I'd saved a copy of that draft. Habit. I want to be honest with you about how I felt in those days between my MD's office and what happened next. I wasn't calm in the way people sometimes are in stories about workplace injustice, the kind of composed, steely protagonist who doesn't crack. I cried in my car on the Thursday night. I called my mom and didn't tell her what was happening, but just needed to hear her voice. I lay awake on Friday, running through every possible way this could go wrong. What if they didn't believe me? What if the evidence wasn't enough? What if my team lost their jobs because someone had decided the story was already written? Theo didn't know what was coming, and watching him make a terrible pun about the morning's coffee on Friday felt like a small, private grief. Vashti brought in homemade Anzac biscuits on Friday afternoon and left them on the shared desk, and I ate 2 of them and thought, these are good people. These are really good people, and they didn't do anything wrong, and I am not going to let this happen to them. That's when calm became something else, something quieter and more determined. I spent the weekend organizing everything I had into a single, properly sequenced document, time-stamped, cross-referenced, every anomaly mapped against the official transaction records. I noted where my evidence was strong and where it was circumstantial. I didn't overstate anything. I wrote it the way I would write a compliance report because that's exactly what it was. On Sunday night, I sent it to no one. I just saved it in 3 places, and I went to sleep. The meeting happened on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock. My MD had called it. When I arrived at the boardroom, I found not just my MD, but also my head of advisory, the firm's external legal counsel, a sharp-faced woman I'll call our legal counsel, who I'd met once before at a staff function, and an HR representative I hadn't seen before, a man who turned out to be from the external HR firm the company used for disciplinary matters. My team had been asked to wait in the main meeting room on the floor below. They'd been told there was a company-wide briefing. They didn't know yet that the briefing was about them. I was told to sit at one end of the table. The HR man had a printed document in front of him. My head of advisory was sitting with his hands folded, wearing a particular expression I can only describe as carefully neutral, the face of someone who has rehearsed not looking guilty. My MD began. He laid out the findings again. The $1.4 million discrepancy, the redirected fees, the authorization codes. He was careful and thorough. And then he said that given the audit findings, the firm was considering standing down the compliance team pending a full investigation, and that today's meeting was to give me an opportunity to respond before any formal action was taken. I said, "Before I respond, I'd like to ask a question." My legal counsel looked up. Did the external audit identify the IP address from which the authorization codes were used? There was a brief pause. My MD glanced at the audit summary in front of him and said yes, it was in the technical appendix. And does that IP address correspond to any of the workstations used by my team? Another pause. Longer. I'd need to check that detail, he said. I've already checked, I said. It doesn't. I opened my laptop, which I had brought, and I turned it so the screen was visible to everyone at the table. I had the document open. I walked them through it, not quickly, not defensively, but clearly and in order. The after-hours access times against our swipe card records, the IP address mismatch, the notation pattern in the transaction references, the deleted draft document, and my saved copy. I watched my head of advisory very carefully while I spoke. For the first 8 minutes, his expression remained that careful, neutral. And then I got to the section about the notation pattern and the deleted draft, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Just slightly, just enough. The authorization codes used in these transactions were not used by my team, I said, when I'd finished walking them through the document. They were used by someone who had obtained those codes through access they should not have had. I don't know yet exactly how that access was obtained. But I do know that I have 6 weeks of documented evidence that tells a different story than the one that was brought to this table today. The room was very quiet. The legal counsel was writing something on her notepad, quickly, not looking up. My MD looked at my head of advisory, and my head of advisory, for the first time since I'd sat down, looked away. What came after that was not fast. I want to be honest about that, because in the version of this story that lives in my head, the clean, satisfying version, everything unraveled immediately in that boardroom, and justice was swift and complete. In reality, it took 11 more days. The external auditors were brought back in. The technical team did a full trace on the IP addresses and access logs. The firm's legal counsel engaged a forensic accountant. My team remained on a modified arrangement during that period, not stood down, but not conducting their usual work, which was its own particular kind of limbo. Theo asked me on the third day what was going on, and I told him that there had been a discrepancy flagged in an audit and that we were cooperating with the investigation. I told him I needed him to trust me. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Do we need to be worried?" And I said, "Not if I have anything to do with it." I meant that with everything I had. The forensic accountant's findings took 8 days. On the 9th day, I was called back into my MD's office. This time he was sitting. This time he looked like a man who had not been sleeping well. My head of advisory had been with the firm for 11 years. In that time, he had developed very particular access, not just to client accounts, but to the internal systems architecture. He knew where the authorization codes were stored. He knew the rotation schedules. And starting approximately 14 months ago, working in coordination with one other senior advisor on the team, a man I'll call his associate, who had joined the firm 3 years earlier, he had been systematically redirecting advisory fees from 3 high-value client accounts through the holding account and eventually into a series of managed structures that the S&TA, forensic accountant, was still untangling. The total, at the point the audit had caught it, was $1.4 million. The projected total, had it continued, would have been higher, significantly higher. My team's authorization codes had been obtained through a phishing email that had gone to Rupert 7 months earlier. He'd clicked a link, a convincing one, the IT team confirmed, designed to look like an internal system update prompt, And without knowing it, he'd exposed the team's credentials. He was devastated when he found out. I told him that what happened was not a lapse on his part, but a deliberate, technically sophisticated attack by someone who had inside knowledge of our systems. He nodded, but I could tell he'd be sitting with that for a while. I don't fully blame him for that. Guilt is not always rational. My MD told me all of this in a voice that was measured and quiet, and at the end of it he said, "I owe you and your team a significant apology." I said, "I know you do." That wasn't sharp. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't being sharp. I was being honest. He had walked into that first meeting with a version of events already forming, and my team had been fitted into the available space. He hadn't done it with malice. But the willingness to accept the easy narrative, to trust the structure of authority over the people doing the quiet, careful work underneath it, that had a cost. It had a real human cost, and my team had carried it for 11 days, not knowing how it was going to end. He understood that. I could see that he understood it, and that mattered to me more than I expected. The two men responsible, my head of advisory and his associate, were dismissed that day. The matter was referred to the Serious Fraud Office. I don't know, as of now, exactly where that process has landed. I know it is ongoing. I know that the 3 affected client accounts have been remediated. I know that the holding account structures are being unwound. And I know that my team came back to full duties on the Monday morning after the forensic findings, and Vashti brought Anzac biscuits again, and Theo made a truly terrible pun, and Saren looked around at everyone with an expression that said she understood something had happened, even if she didn't yet know the full shape of it. My MD asked me, about 3 weeks later, if I would consider stepping into an expanded role, effectively taking on oversight that had previously sat under the advisory function, with a new title, a new reporting line directly to him, and a salary that reflected it. He said he wanted to restructure the relationship between compliance and advisory so that what had happened could not happen again in that way. I said I would think about it. I did think about it. For about a week. I talked to my mum. I talked to Vashti, who said, "You'd be very good at it," in that quiet way she has that doesn't feel like flattery because she's never flattering. I went for a long walk around the bays on a Saturday afternoon and watched the water and thought about what kind of professional I wanted to be and what kind of firm I wanted to build that in. I said yes. There were conditions. My team would come with me in their current roles, with title adjustments and pay reviews. The compliance and advisory functions would have formal independence from each other, separate reporting lines, separate system access, regular third-party audits. Phishing awareness training would be mandatory, quarterly, for every staff member in the firm, and the authorization code system would be overhauled by the IT team. My MD agreed to every condition without negotiating. I'm still at Cowrie Financial Partners. My team is still with me. Rupert hasn't made a single error in the months since he was always meticulous, but there is a particular kind of meticulousness that comes from someone who has decided they will never be caught exposed again. I understand that completely. I want to say something, now that this story has been told, to anyone who finds themselves in a version of it. Documentation is not distrust. There's a version of professional culture, and I grew up in it, we all grew up in it, that treats record-keeping like an accusation waiting to happen. Like you're only writing things down because you already believe someone is going to lie to you. That's not what it is. Documentation is clarity. It's the record of what actually happened, built in the ordinary moments before anything has gone wrong. It's the quiet habit that transforms a he said, she said into something a forensic accountant can work with. Start keeping records from your first day in any role, not your first day of trouble. Keep them somewhere you own, not only on company systems. Note the things that feel slightly off, even when you can't say why yet. You don't have to act on every instinct. But having a record of the instinct, with a date attached, turns out to matter. And the second thing, power that goes unexamined is a structural problem, not just a personal one. My head of advisory had been trusted by the firm for 11 years. That trust had become so assumed that it had stopped being examined. The access he had accumulated to systems, to authorization processes, to the institutional knowledge of how everything worked, had been granted piece by piece over time, and no one had ever stood back and looked at the whole picture. Not because anyone was foolish, because trust, when it is long established, becomes invisible, and invisible things are the hardest to audit. The lesson isn't to distrust people who have earned trust over time. The lesson is that trust, like compliance, needs periodic review. That is not cynicism. That is good governance. And the last thing, and this one, is for the people in my team's position, the ones sitting in the uncertainty for 11 days, not knowing which way it was going to fall. I know how frightening that is. I know how much it costs to keep showing up and doing your work carefully and professionally when you are afraid. What got me through wasn't certainty. I didn't know, in those 11 days, that the forensic findings would say what they said. I hoped. I believed the evidence was clear. But I didn't know. What got me through was the habit. The consistency. The fact that I had spent 3 years doing the work exactly as carefully as I'd done it, which meant that when the moment came, the record existed. I didn't build the documentation for the crisis. The documentation was just what I did. And when the crisis arrived, it was already there. Build the habit before you need it. That's all. Build the habit before you need it, and trust that the careful, quiet work is never wasted, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. I've thought a lot about what actually made the difference in all of this. Not the outcome. The outcome was almost secondary, in a way. What I keep coming back to is the sequence of small, unglamorous choices that made the outcome possible. I didn't document everything because I suspected something was wrong. I documented because I'd learned, early on, that clarity is a form of care. Care for your work, for your team, for the truth of what actually happened on any given day. That habit existed long before my head of advisory started redirecting client funds into accounts that weren't his to touch. And because it existed, I had something to stand on when the floor disappeared. That's the thing about integrity that nobody really talks about. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the choice you make on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon to note something down, to save a copy, to be precise when being approximate would be easier. Theo and Vashti and Rupert didn't do anything heroic during those 11 days. They showed up. They did their work carefully. They trusted that careful work had value even when the people above them had temporarily forgotten that. That is its own kind of courage. The quiet, unsexy kind that doesn't get named or celebrated, but holds everything together. And my head of advisory, I've thought about him too, more than I expected to. 11 years at the firm. He'd built real relationships, real knowledge, real standing. And he used all of it to take something that wasn't his and to point the finger at the people least likely to be believed when they pushed back. That's not a failure of intelligence. He was a smart man. It's a failure of something harder to teach and harder to recover the understanding that what you do when no one is watching is exactly who you are. He made choices, one after another, that compounded. The cover-up became more elaborate than the original act. The people he needed to sacrifice became more numerous, and eventually, the structure he'd built to protect himself became the very thing that exposed him, because careful people had been watching all along. Actions accumulate. They always do. The good ones and the bad ones both. Rupert's accidental click on that phishing link accumulated into weeks of guilt he didn't deserve. My 6 weeks of documentation accumulated into the thing that cleared my team's name. My head of advisory's 14 months of redirected fees accumulated into a forensic accountant's report that told a story he could not talk his way out of. I think about Saren, sometimes the newest member of my team, 6 months in when all of this happened. She sat through those 11 uncertain days without fully understanding what was at stake, and she came out the other side watching the rest of us simply get back to work. I hope she took something from that. Not the drama of it, not the vindication, but the part before that, the part where you keep your records, do your job with precision, and trust that the truth of what you've done is already written down somewhere, waiting. That's all I'd say to anyone going through something like this. The habit is the thing. Build it on an ordinary day. Maintain it on a boring one. And trust that the person you are in the quiet, careful, unwitnessed moments is the person who will be standing when it counts.